Thank you, my loyal subjects. I'm so glad you're all enjoying the show. And I you, my fellow Roman, and I you.
Please be emperor
Forever? Well, just for you I'll try. Now who wants another song?
Stop right there, Princeps. You're under arrest.
What? On what grounds?
What grounds? There are many. For starters, you burned down Rome.
What? No, I didn't. I wasn't anywhere near Rome when it happened.
Okay, well, you kicked your pregnant wife to death.
Oh, come off it. That was a rumor. I loved her dearly.
Well, what about you murdering your own mother?
Okay, first off, she was very annoying.
Get him.
Nero is a name that often conjures up ideas of a tyrant or a crazed ruler or an anime girl. And I'm just saying that to get it out of the way for the person who's going to say it in the comments. Don't say it. It's not what the video's about. He fiddled while Rome burned. He murdered his own mother, and he'd go on to kick his pregnant wife to death. Not content with that, Nero, the actor-emperor, would even perform on the stage publicly. A disgusting idea to any self-respecting Roman. And his performances weren't even any good, but he forced people to attend and forced people to applaud. As a matter of fact, if you left early, you might even be subject to execution, meaning some women would give birth during his performances, and some men would even fake their own deaths just to get out of the performance a couple hours early. Finally, after 14 years? Rome had had enough. Nero had just raised taxes on urine, nonetheless, just to fund the building of some magnificent palace he was trying to make. And so the people in the provinces decided to revolt. The Senate withdrew their support, as did his own personal guard, and Nero fled the palace. The city of Rome celebrated his death, and the Julio-Claudian dynasty, filled with tyrants and despots since the time of Augustus, finally came to an end. Well, this is the story we're told, anyway. Some of you watching may have heard differently, that Nero had done nothing wrong and was wildly popular with the lower classes. His downfall was more a betrayal of the Senate, who were threatened by his populism. And these two contradictory stories are what I want to examine today, looking at not just the historical records, but also archaeological records, coinage, and even non-historical writings from around the time period to see if we can come up with a clearer picture of who Nero might have been. There are three main sources modern historians pull the story of Nero from: the accounts of Tacitus, Suetonius, and Dio. Now, there are a few other historians who mention Nero, notably Josephus and Pliny the Elder, but only those first three mention the story of Nero from start to finish. And the historians we're going to be using as primary sources were writing at a minimum of 60 years after these events, and at a maximum 150 years after these events. And even beyond that, there's no original accounts from Dio about this period. You may have seen several people cite certain things of Dio, but they're not citing him. They're citing what's known as his epitomes, meaning summaries put together by a later Byzantine Christian monk, Zephinius. I'm really sorry if anyone speaks Greek. I am probably going to butcher that and a bunch of other names throughout this video. And that's not even taking into account the biases of the historians themselves. After Nero died, there was a civil war, which most people refer to as the Year of the Four Emperors, even though it was 18 months, but that's a little less catchy. The emperor who eventually took over, Vespasian, lacked any kind of ancestral authority as his claim to the throne. Suetonius even saying that he lacked majesty. Because of this, many historians argue that the Flavians engaged in quite a bit of propaganda, painting the later Julio-Claudians as all these kind of crazy debaucherous despots that the Flavians had to come along and save everyone from. And many of the historians we think of as these authoritative sources on Roman history from this time period were writing under Vespasian and his Flavian dynasty, or the later Nerva Antonine dynasty. Tacitus even claiming Vespasian gave him his start, and Josephus supposedly being freed by Vespasian, even lauding certain actions Vespasian took despite condemning those exact same actions when they'd been performed by Nero. This doesn't mean we can't use them at all, but it does mean we need to take them with a grain of salt, and that it'd be useful to look at any other evidence we can find outside of their works that might either back up or cast doubt on their claims. So when we look at these histories, or indeed any story that we hear, we have to think about who's telling it, what they're saying, and why they're saying it. Oh, and if you're wondering what those numbers at the bottom of the screen are, think of them like footnotes. I have in my video description a companion document linked, which has all those numbers corresponding to sources, almost always with direct links that you can just click on and then read the source for yourself. We're going to take a look at all the evidence we can find and see if we can't cobble together a picture of the last descendant of Augustus to rule Rome. The first real story we get about Nero comes from his birth, where his mother receives a prophecy that he will rule and kill her. And she responds with, "Then let him kill me, so long that he rules." And Romans love to do stuff like this with prophecies. One of my favorites is Dio. We'll talk about how towards the end of Nero's reign, it was literally raining blood, and Nero was just kind of ignoring it. So they love this like prophecy or things being fated thing. Nero's mother was Agrippina the Younger, daughter of Agrippina the Elder, daughter of Julia the Elder, daughter of Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. This made Augustus Nero's great-great-grandfather. Agrippina also had the good fortune of being the sister of Emperor Caligula, who was the emperor before Nero. So Nero did grow up close to the imperial household. In fact, supposedly, when he was 10 years old, Nero made a public appearance next to the Emperor Claudius's son Britannicus. And at that appearance, a ceremonial reenactment of the Battle of Troy, Nero wowed everyone with his skills. Unfortunately, he even outshone Britannicus, leading to Claudius's wife, Messalina, attempting to kill Nero. The story goes that the assassins crept into Nero's room, but were scared away by a snake they found in Nero's bed. Apparently, Nero himself even doubted this story, so like I said, we're kind of off to a great start. And that's the problem with a lot of imperial childhoods. It's basically just a bunch of rumors and speculation because at the time when this was happening, no one really cared who Nero was. Whether or not the snake story actually happened, as we'll see, Nero certainly grew up around a lot of death and intrigue, which, in my opinion, really kind of messed him up from childhood. After a whole bunch of drama that I went into in my last video, Claudius ends up marrying Nero's mother, Agrippina. Claudius formally adopts Nero as his son and even has coins minted to celebrate the occasion. His mother had even arranged things such that Seneca the Younger, a very famous Stoic philosopher even at the time, would be set up as Nero's tutor and would also install members of the Praetorian Guard that preferred Nero over Claudius's son Britannicus. During this time, Nero gave a few speeches, which were all relatively well received, even though they probably were just written by Seneca. They weren't really on incredibly controversial topics. It was normally like, hey, could we do tax relief on this place that just had a natural disaster? So, how brave. During this time, Agrippina would also marry Nero to Octavia, Claudius's daughter and now Nero's adoptive sister. As the story goes, Claudius actually regretted setting up Nero in this way towards the end of his life, and actually began to favor Britannicus, his natural-born son. Agrippina, upon realizing Claudius favored his natural son, eventually had Claudius poisoned by mushrooms, and, before the body was even cold, had the Praetorian Guard proclaim Nero the emperor, then getting the Senate to simply follow suit. This is our first example of how much can we trust the big three. Modern scholars are actually split as to whether or not Agrippina actually poisoned Claudius. Claudius was a 60-year-old man when he had been poisoned, and according to some of the other historians, had had a weak constitution for basically his entire life. However, this video isn't about Agrippina, and there isn't much evidence either way, so I'll leave it up to you to determine what you think happened, but for me personally, I do lean towards poison, just a little bit. Interestingly, Seneca, who was both banished and pardoned under Claudius, wrote a piece describing Claudius's poisoning as ultimately a good thing. Seneca then goes on to talk about Nero's virtues and say that the sun is essentially rising on a new day for the Roman Empire. Seneca also writes a lot about Nero in his work on clemency, which supposedly was published the same year Nero took the throne, mostly praising Nero, but also trying to guide him on the best way to rule. Now, you can read all of this as sophistry if you like, and there are plenty of claims, even from the ancient historians, that Seneca was a bit of a hypocrite, something he even semi-owned up to himself later. But I want to take a look at one passage where he's advising on the relationship that should be between the emperor and Rome itself.
Bees have but one mind, till their king doth die. But when he dies, disorderly they fly. Such a misfortune will be the end of the peace of Rome. It will wreck the prosperity of this great people. The nation will be free from danger as long as it knows how to endure the rains. The last day of Rome's empire will be that upon which it forgets how to obey. So Seneca is saying Rome needs its emperor. The people need to obey him or face disaster. And keep in mind, this is from the tutor of Nero.
Nero gave a speech upon being proclaimed Caesar to the Senate, in which he essentially promises a return to an Augustinian style of rule, in which the Senate and the individual senators have their rights respected. The Senate loved this speech so much, they actually voted that all consuls, when they took office, should have to give this speech, and had it inscribed on silver tablets. And from what we could tell, Nero would be true to his word on this, for a time at least. During this time, we can see a lot of gold and silver coins minted that include references to the Senate, something that not even Augustus had done. The old expression went that the Senate owned the copper and the emperor owned the silver and gold.
So Nero, age 17, comes to power in 54 AD, and one of his first acts is to crack down on gladiatorial shows held in the provinces outside of Rome. That resulted in bloodshed.
Now, this wasn't actually out of left field. Augustus had also stated a rule that no one should die in those games. Also, around this time, Tigranes, however you say that, an Armenian born in Rome, was crowned king of Armenia by Nero, set up as a client king and sent into Armenia. Not super important to know now, just know that eventually he would end up causing a very big war down the line.
Nero also proposed eliminating the taxes that people had to pay when they moved between the provinces, and possibly even taxes when they brought stuff in from outside the empire.
This wasn't directly a let's lower taxes to please the plebs kind of situation, though. It was more that these taxes were proving very burdensome to both the people in the border provinces and also the merchants. Because back in the day, it wasn't like, oh, you're crossing the border, pay me 2 gold. It was, I will have a tax collector with a gang of men go around, tell you how much you owe in taxes, and then get it from you however they can.
In the end, however, his advisors point out that the loss of revenue would hurt the imperial treasury far too much, and so Nero relents, showing that he could be swayed by sound argument, at least for now. Nero could be quite high-minded and even forward-thinking, but he often lacked a certain grounding or an understanding of the realities that his solution might have to overcome. However, he was able to set up a system of oversight for these tax collectors, cutting down on corruption. This is something even Tacitus gives him credit for.
He also increased governmental transparency by banning closed-door trials, worked with someone who would eventually be a pretty big political rival of his to crack down on the corruption of the governors, and even allowed slaves to bring cases against their masters. Making the Senate happy, Nero also removed many freedmen from positions of power. Freedmen were, just like it sounds like, freed slaves, but a lot of times these people would work as scribes and personal assistants. However, under Claudius and Caligula, they had actually gained quite a bit of power for themselves. Nero also won some popularity when he sided against the Jews in Syria. The Jews wanted more rights at the time, and Nero basically said, no, you have to stay second-class citizens, which, given the rest of history, Nero was a real trendsetter here. As an example of how kind Nero was, Suetonius relates the story that when a death warrant was presented to Nero for his signature, Nero responded, "How I wish that I had never learned to write." He also hosted private games at his villa. Real quickly, games was a general term for the Romans that referred to any sort of public competition. So an acting competition would be a game, but also an athletic competition would be a game. Now, Nero would eventually be known for his artistic pursuits, and during this time period, we even have Seneca noting that Nero clearly has a flair for the dramatic and a good eye for art. In fact, during this period, Suetonius tells us that he wrote poetry which was so well received, the Senate voted thanksgivings over it and had it inscribed in gold and placed in the temple of Jupiter. So before we leave this kind of golden age of Nero's reign, let's take a look of what we know of him up to this point.
And from what we've seen, Nero's not that bad of a ruler. He's well liked by the people, the Senate, and the army. His poetry is pretty well received, and many of his edicts and laws are seen as quite just and even benevolent at times. He has many brilliant solutions to some of the problems he sees in the world, but a lot of times he won't think through what those solutions would actually entail, or some of the effects that could come about as a result of them. I actually had a boss like this once who would come up with ideas, and then when we tried to explain to him that they wouldn't work, would just act confused. Like early in COVID one time, he had this idea that different bandmates could play together over Zoom from different locations. And while we tried to explain to him that there was lag and that it wouldn't necessarily work the way he's envisioning it, he would just sit there and go, but this makes so much sense in my head. So when there's some later accounts of Nero asking if something could be done and everyone around him just saying yes, I feel for those people.
He also understands his role within the greater empire and so chooses to pay homage to the Senate. There's even an interesting moment where a couple senators aren't able to scrape up enough cash to meet the requirements to maintain the senatorial rank. Around this time, you actually needed certain net worth thresholds to be considered members of certain classes. And Nero pays out of his own pocket to help two senators who weren't able to meet those requirements. Nero would also say that he'd contribute 60 million sesterces out of his own pocket every year to the treasury in order to help the economy, something that, to be fair, was a tradition going all the way back to Augustus. Now, you might be thinking, this all sounds pretty good, and don't worry, we'll get to the bad stuff later, but in this period, the first 5 years of his rule, none of the bad stuff really seems to have been civil or legislative. Indeed, most people critical of Nero actually look at his first 5 years as a pretty good period of rule. However, Tacitus and some modern historians attribute this good period of rule to his advisors, Seneca and Burrus, and not to Nero himself. So let's look instead at the juicy personal stuff. There were three keys to power in ancient Rome: the people, the Senate, and the army. Nero was quite popular with the people, Seneca was quite popular with the Senate, and Burrus was quite popular with the army. So where did that leave the person who'd moved heaven and earth to get Nero into power? His mother, Agrippina. Well, at first, it actually seems like it left her in a pretty good place, essentially ruling through Nero as sort of a puppet. We have statues like this, where the young emperor is seen as less than his mother. And we even have coins being minted from around this time that show sometimes Nero and Agrippina, but sometimes Agrippina alone. Tacitus even relates to us that the Senate moved their meeting place to somewhere where Agrippina could sit in and listen, although from behind a curtain, they weren't doing anything crazy now. She also was awarded many powers, including her own private royal guard, and at one point even being voted into a high priestessship. Supposedly, tensions between Agrippina, Seneca, and Burrus came to a head when Nero was supposed to greet a foreign dignitary. Agrippina walks into the room, planning to take her place next to Nero, something that Seneca realized would be insulting to the incoming dignitaries. So with his quick thinking, he was able to say to Nero, hey, why don't you greet your mother and then show her to her seat, essentially making sure that she couldn't sit next to Nero. So Nero, upon taking the throne, almost immediately began an affair with a freedwoman. Now, supposedly this affair was actually encouraged by Seneca and Burrus because it annoyed Agrippina. It was actually Nero sort of distancing himself from his mother. So Nero's mother was basically seeing her power slipping on all sides, and even seeing her connection with her son being eroded by the introduction of a new woman. Again, to the point of being a good story, we'll never know quite why their relationship soured. All we'll know is that it did happen. And this isn't me just pulling from those big three historians. It's also imperial coinage at the time reflecting this attitude, with her vanishing from coins and statues altogether. Though to be fair, there is a small caveat in that we don't know how many statues of Nero have really survived to us. So the accounts of the big three for this area, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Dio, state that Agrippina, in a desperate attempt to hold on to her power, began to threaten Nero. Tacitus claims that when Agrippina began to fall out of favor, she turned to the freedman Pallas, who had been named Secretary of Treasurer, essentially, under Claudius, the previous emperor, and had gained quite a bit of power for himself as a result. Nero, in part of his purchase of the freedmen, would eventually get rid of Pallas. His mother, feeling cornered, would threaten Nero with supporting his stepbrother Britannicus when Britannicus came of age, going so far as saying she would march into camp and get the army to proclaim him Caesar. Dio, again writing about 120 years after the other two, leaves it a little more ambiguous. More of Agrippina just stating, hey, I made you emperor and I can unmake you. even though Dio also kind of acknowledges that that doesn't really make sense. Keep in mind, for Nero, being deposed was essentially the same as being killed. The previous two emperors, Caligula and Claudius, had both ended their reigns by being assassinated, supposedly. And keep in mind, too, that Agrippina had already made one emperor, again by killing the previous one. So it's not unreasonable for Nero to assume his mother is threatening to kill him here. But really think about what that has to do to you. Your own mother telling you to your face that she's going to kill you. Nero probably had some deep-seated mommy issues, but what he also had growing at this time was probably quite a bit of paranoia, which leads to one of the first bad things Nero did during his reign, the murder of his brother Britannicus. The story goes that after Agrippina's threats, or because Britannicus sang better than Nero, or for no particular reason at all, Nero decided to poison Britannicus. The death seems to have been quite public, at a banquet attended not only by Agrippina and Octavia, remember, Britannicus' sister, but also plenty of other nobles. The story goes that Britannicus was already wary of being poisoned, and Nero had indeed already tried to poison him, but it hadn't worked. Therefore, Britannicus already had a food taster checking his food for poison. However, Britannicus was served wine, which he complained was too hot, and so cold water was poured in to cool it. The story goes the poison was contained in the cool water. Britannicus took one sip, immediately started seizing, and passed out right then and there. The Nero did nothing wrong camp will often point out that poison was a common political tool in ancient Rome, and that Britannicus was in fact a rival to the throne. However, after doing my research, I don't know that Nero poisoned Britannicus at all. There are a few weird things about this story. Supposedly, Britannicus was seizing as he died, with Nero even making a comment that these seizures were known and in a little bit he'd get up and be fine. Although we don't have a lot of evidence either way, these claims don't come completely out of left field. Caesar himself may have suffered from seizures, and even Augustus, his nephew, may have as well. And keep in mind, in a lot of these Julio-Claudian relationships, it was a lot of cousins marrying cousins. If some of those genes were in that family, they might have been pretty widespread. Dio, who again wrote much later than the other two, also indicates that these seizures of Britannicus were well known. However, he mentions it more in Agrippina, like unfairly spreading this to indicate why Britannicus shouldn't take the throne. But Agrippina didn't kill Britannicus, so it's not really relevant to that part of the story. Now, dying from a seizure just by itself is actually quite rare, although obviously you can die from choking on something or falling and hitting yourself or cutting yourself or something along those lines. However, there is a condition known as SUDEP, sudden death in epilepsy. So it's possible that Britannicus could have died as a result of this seizure.
I've also seen a couple things in my research that says the seizures may actually have been mini strokes, so that's a possibility as well, in which case he may have just died from a stroke.
One other note I wanted to save until the end is that in the original story, Nero is apparently like super drunk while all this is happening. Like so drunk he was almost unconscious. Seems a little odd that the night Nero was planning this murder, he would get so drunk he could barely maintain consciousness. It could be nerves, of course, but in that case it's pretty impressive that Nero could be that drunk and play off murdering his own stepbrother as if it was nothing. Lastly, Dio confirms the poisoning was revealed later. That poisoning had caused blotches to break out on Britannicus' skin, and so Nero had covered it up with gypsum. However, as he was leading the body through the rain washed off the gypsum and everyone could see these blotches. Now, supposedly the person who actually made the poison was named Locusta, or something. But she was also supposed to be the person who had poisoned Claudius. Now, keep in mind that Claudius, a man of 60 years who already had a weak constitution, still took a full day to die after he had ingested his poisoned mushroom. Britannicus, by comparison, seemed to have died in seconds. However, from the records we could find, there was no poisoning known to the Romans at the time that could have done that. To give a brief overview of Roman poisons, and wow, we are way off track here, they mostly came from plants. Now, the popular plants at the time were those of the belladonna family, such as nightshade, but there was also monkshood, opium, hellebore, yew, and the celebrity of the group, hemlock. Every single poison will take a bit to take effect, and by a bit, I mean at least 20 minutes, if not an entire day, to finally kill you. Hemlock and nightshade are the exceptions to that, but even they will take several hours to kill you, and none of them will knock you unconscious right from the start. In addition, when Dio talks about the skin blotches revealing the poisoning, skin blotches are known side effects of certain of these poisons. However, it's normally kind of a swelling, like a sort of an antihistamine type reaction. But the blotches would have presented themselves that night, if not immediately as it was happening. And it wouldn't have made sense for Britannicus's face to be swelling up as Nero's like, no, it's just epilepsy. Don't worry about it. I shouldn't be. I feel bad laughing over a dead child, but I don't know. I find it funny. Now, could the poison have triggered a seizure and Britannicus merely died while he was unable to communicate? Look, I have to stop my research somewhere, and I'm currently trying to solve a 2,000-year-old cold case, and I don't really feel like getting my medical license. So any doctors, assassins, or feds, be sure to let me know in the comments whether or not this is possible. Honestly, the biggest thing preventing me from just saying there's no way Nero did this is it's just such a good story. Like, Agrippina goes to Nero and says, hey, just so you know, I'm going to kill you and replace you with your stepbrother. And then suddenly Britannicus is dead. If I was a detective, Nero is the first person I would question. But we also have to remember that the account of Agrippina threatening to replace Nero with Britannicus only comes from Tacitus, the same account that has Britannicus dramatically being poisoned at this very public banquet in front of his sister, where everyone just ignores his corpse for a while for some reason. Like in Tacitus's version of events, Britannicus takes a sip, immediately loses his breath and dies, and then Nero says, oh, don't worry, this is just epilepsy, he'll be fine. And so everyone just goes back to partying, not realizing that this kid isn't moving or breathing. And then a few hours later, they do realize that he's dead, so they quickly have a funeral the same night. I'm not saying it's impossible. This is just a really weird series of events. But if you think of it like a story, it does make sense because it's very, very dramatic, with Britannicus's funeral even being held in a torrential downpour, as if the gods themselves are mad at Nero.
One other note too. Suetonius tells us Britannicus was actually buried later, not that same night. And Tacitus only claims it was the same night so he can throw in the remark that the pyre had been prepared beforehand, indicating Nero knew Britannicus would die tonight. So interesting that the clearest version of the story may have a little fib in there to pin it more squarely on Nero than it should be.
And it's also possible, and this is something you always have to keep in mind, that these accounts are just completely over-dramatized. Possible that Britannicus actually drank his wine and was fine and went on to get sick and die several hours or days later. But all the evidence we have to go off of is these stories, and so that's all we can analyze when we try and draw our conclusion. So, did Nero kill his brother and potential political rival?
Personally, I don't think so. From the character of Nero we've seen up until now, he doesn't seem to love violence, and the lack of a method for him to poison Britannicus as described gives me pause, though I'll admit this isn't the firmest of my convictions. Like I said, there was a lot of reasons him doing this would make sense.
So now we come to the end of Nero's first 5-year period. He assumed the throne in 54, so we're now at 59. And in this year, story goes, he killed his mother. From the accounts we have, after the death of Britannicus, Agrippina kind of retreated from pressing Nero so much and began to just kind of gather allies and money around her. Also keep in mind that Britannicus was murdered in 55. So what happened in the middle if Agrippina didn't die until 59? One thing that we do know is she was accused of another conspiracy to remove Nero from the throne, replacing him with Rubellius Plautus. According to Tacitus, this was both a trumped-up charge, and Nero had to be talked down from taking immediate action against his mother. Though several years later, Nero would eventually exile Plautus over several conflicting reasons, depending on who you listen to. And again, deposing Nero and killing him were basically the same thing. So again, Nero's mother is threatening to kill him here. Now, Tacitus also seems to claim Poppaea, someone who would eventually become Dio's second wife, was the person pushing him to kill his mother because she wanted to marry him, and at the time, he wasn't really going to be able to divorce Octavia with his mother around. This doesn't make a ton of sense to me because why? She doesn't have any real political power at this point, so why would she be the one standing in the way of it? And even other historians don't necessarily believe this because at the time when Agrippina was murdered, Poppaea was still married to Otho. So it'd be a little weird for her to be like, hurry up and kill your mother so that we can get married when they wouldn't even marry until 3 years later, and she was already married at the time. So, like I said, again, just pick a story. So Nero decided that he had to kill his mother. His first attempt was with a self-collapsing boat, which feels needlessly complicated, but Suetonius, Dio, and Tacitus all talk about it. So I don't know. However, in the end, all agree that she is eventually killed by just Nero sending someone to kill her. According to Tacitus and Dio, ever the dramatists, she points to her womb and shouts some variation of, strike here for this born Nero. Which, like, for some reason, all the historians, anytime anyone's gonna die, they, like, say something cool or badass or something, which just is not... I don't know. Maybe it did happen that way. Who knows? Suetonius and Tacitus also relate that Nero had fabricated a charge of assassination against Agrippina, that she had sent one of her freedmen with a dagger to kill Nero, even though that dagger had just been planted by one of Nero's guards. Whether this is real or not is frankly anyone's guess, but the fact does remain that it is almost certain that Nero did kill his mother. Afterwards, Nero even sent a letter to the Senate explaining why he had done it. Supposedly, the letter had been written by Seneca, and the Senate seemed to like the letter and voted thanksgivings because most of them really didn't like Agrippina because, she had tried to take power from the Senate. However, Tacitus also notes that Seneca writing this letter turned a lot of people against him. And though Nero didn't end up taking the blame, the Senate started to dislike Seneca. Honestly, Nero was in a tough spot, and murder was an effective political tool in ancient Rome. After all, Nero had gained power by his mother murdering his stepfather, and the Senate, Seneca, and the Roman people at large seemed to approve of it. And now your mother, sensing that her power is waning, is supporting one after another of your political rivals so that she can regain her power. I mean, what other option is there at this point? While Suetonius and Dio note that Nero took sort of a sick pleasure in his mother's death, even examining her body with a glass of wine in hand and remarking how beautiful she was, Tacitus gives us a different story entirely. Supposedly, after the boat fiasco failed, Nero went to Seneca and Burrus and basically said, hey, I think I got to do this. How do I do it? Supposedly, the two actually agreed this was the correct course of action to take, although Tacitus claims they may have only said that because they were afraid to tell Nero no and have him go ahead with it anyway and do it the wrong way, so to speak, and screw things up for everyone. However, that strikes me as odd because up to this point, they'd been able to convince or dissuade Nero from things as they saw fit. I think, too, his actions after her murder might be a really good view into the character of Nero. Tacitus goes on to say that Nero passed the entire night in silence, broken only by the occasional moment of terror when he thought the end was nigh. But even in the morning, when soldiers congratulate Nero on escaping the thumb of his mother, essentially, he doesn't relax or get happy or anything. He slips further into melancholy, like he was driven to a decision that he didn't want to make. Now, just to be clear, Tacitus's overall opinion is that Nero was driven into this decision by a woman, so cringe, and that this was the turning point where Nero would begin his slide into debauchery. So very much Tacitus is not taking Nero's side here. Just want to make that clear. I wanted to include that moment because for me, it was just so interesting that Tacitus would include this rather humanizing moment in someone that he will go on to paint as a monster. And to me, at least, speaks to the fact that a story like this must have existed at the time. I think it's significant that Nero didn't kill his mother back when she was threatening to replace him with Britannicus, and instead did it later when another conspiracy came to light, where, again, she would have been trying to kill Nero in order to depose him. I think this speaks to a part of Nero's character that's only going to grow as time goes on, namely his paranoia. Before sending the letter to the Senate, though, Nero had left town and was nervous about his return to Rome and how he'd be received. After all, he had committed the sin of matricide at this point. But apparently he worried for nothing, because supposedly everyone turned out to welcome him home, and it was a great big party. And that just about wraps up the first 5 years, so let's move on to... There's an interesting bit of trivia I want to mention before we get into this next section. Trajan, the Optimus Princeps, or best emperor, according to a later historian Aurelian Victor, was known to have remarked that Nero's quinquennium was kind of a golden age for the empire, and all other emperors were kind of second to that period of Nero's reign. Now, the reason I mention that is there's actually a little bit of debate over what Trajan meant by the word quinquennium. Quinquennium refers to a 5-year period, and while most scholars identify it as the first 5 years of Nero's reign, there's some really interesting arguments that it actually was meant to be the second 5 years of Nero's reign.
This is mostly due to the next sentence. The annexation of the Caudian Alps and Pontus happened in 63 and 62 respectively, 8 or 9 years after Nero came to power, firmly in his second 5-year period.
Not super relevant to what we're talking about, so I'll just kind of put a note to the companion doc if you want to read more about that, but just kind of an interesting thing I wanted to share. First and foremost, Nero took a big step forward towards becoming the artist we'd later all know him as. He hosted his first juvenile games in honor of him shaving his beard. This was a time-honored Roman tradition. The first shaving of the beard was considered when you really became a man in the cultural sense. Now, notably, the juvenile games were private games, and as such, certain cultural censures around appearing on stage in public did not apply to these types of venues. And so a great number of people signed up to compete, including senators and equestrians. And even Tacitus notes this was likely successful. And something else to back this up is the next year, Nero would host those quinquennial games. This was to be a series of games repeated every 5 years, which was supposed to be sort of similar to the Olympics. However, the Olympics often had things a bit more segmented, so like the theatrical parts of the Olympics wouldn't be at the same time in Olympia as the athletic events. But for Nero, he was kind of putting them all together in one big grand show. And indeed, these games were even decidedly Greek. However, these games weren't only pushed by Nero. Tacitus also relates to us that the Senate pushed these games as well. And indeed, many senators signed up to compete in these public games. Nero, however, did not. Miriam Griffin, in her book Nero, The End of a Dynasty, makes a really interesting argument that I wanted to share here as well. Up until this point, Nero had undoubtedly been interested in the arts, Seneca even noting that he was quite talented, and Suetonius even saying much the same, going so far as to even say that all the people claiming his works were just stolen from other artists are lying and that it clearly was Nero's original work. Griffin argues this fascination with Greek culture had led Nero to dream of putting on the Olympics in the way the Greeks did, full of nobles competing for glory and honor, both on the field and the stage. She notes that Nero's decision to not only not appear, but to forbid pantomime dancers, which if you didn't see my earlier video, they're like sexy dancers, but check the companion doc if you want to read more about that, shows his aim was to unite these cultures, which up until now had had some kind of odd tensions. Tensions are a bit more complex than I have time to go into right now, but one quote is, "The captured Greece took the victor captive," and I'll put more thoughts in my companion doc if you care. The games were apparently very well received, according to Tacitus and others. Dio also claims that during this time, Nero constructed a magnificent gymnasium, which was still flourishing even under Dio's time, which was about a century and a half later. This may have been the start of Nero's love of building, a trend which we will see continue and would be a source of criticism from his contemporaries, but praise from people who came afterwards. Some of his most famous constructions, aside from the Colossus from which the Colosseum gets its name, included a market and baths. These baths were apparently so well loved that one poet even remarked that he loved even Nero's baths. And when someone asked why he said that, he said, "Even the worst of people can do one good thing." So, kind of funny, but still, shows they were good baths. During this period, Nero also sent out an expedition to try and find the source of the Nile, something which would continue to fascinate people for thousands of years to come. While he wasn't able to find it, reportedly they got as far south as Sudan, and this expedition certainly boosted Nero's popularity. Nero also settled a few new colonies and began a lot of construction projects, one of the biggest being the Domina Transitoria, which was essentially this very big palace which was supposed to connect all the various disparate plots of land that the Principate had acquired over the years.
And this fits in with what I've been saying about his high-minded ideas. His buildings, later people all agree, were beautiful and wonderfully functional. But at the time, I imagine the people were concerned with the cost.
Lastly, Nero set a precedent that sadly would be followed for centuries to come. He debased the currency. Now, this sounds bad. Normally, we want things to be based, not debased, but in this instance, it probably was a very necessary move. The Roman economy had been heading for trouble for a while now.
Big disclaimer here. I am not an economist. I might be getting stuff wrong. If you're an economist and you disagree with what I say, please let me know in the comments. And if you see something on screen right now, it's because someone disagreed with me, and I'll put their notes in the companion document.
The Roman economy had for a long time been propped up by the emperors. However, a much more serious problem was arising in that Rome was running out of metal. You see, one of the nice things about our modern economy is that our money is printed on paper, or, well, cloth, but whatever, same difference. And as a result, we can kind of control the amount of money that's in the economy at any given time. So if suddenly a bunch of money needs to be flooded into the economy, like let's say, I don't know, there's a pandemic and we need to make sure we can pay businesses to keep operating while they're not producing anything of value, we can flood the economy.
This is also helpful because as our economic output and overall economy expands, we can provide more currency to account for that expansion.
It doesn't quite work that way with gold, which is a lot harder to mint and even harder to get back. And a lot of this comes down to international trade. Remember those coins I mentioned with the Senate being marked on them? A lot of those coins were found in India. Indeed, even Pliny lamented that Rome paid Persia untold amounts of gold every year, and all they got back in return was incense, which was just burned for religious festivals. So now you have a weird problem. Currency is leaving the economy, and there isn't enough being minted to make up for the loss. So how do you fix this problem? Well, it's pretty simple. You just print more money. But how do you do that when you can't just dig up more gold? You just make each coin have less gold in it. Nero devised a way by which you could get an extra 15% out of each pound of gold that was turned into coins, debasing the silver to a lesser extent. However, it wasn't really enough to treat the underlying problem, and one of the problems with debasing the currency is you can't pull all the old coins out of circulation, and when you're talking with people who deal internationally, they're going to care about the older coins versus the newer coins. So it's an idea that makes sense, but it didn't really fix the problem Nero was trying to fix with it at the time. Still pretty smart, though. I also had a whole section on the Boudiccan revolt, which I found really interesting, but when I was looking at how long this video was, I just cut it, and it doesn't really have a ton to do with Nero. Here's a little bit in the companion doc if you want to read more about it, but just know this was a rebellion in Britain that Seneca may have been responsible for, although the evidence is kind of spurious at best. All of that would take us to 62. Machiavelli has a quote that I like, where he says, "If a leader must do bad actions, he should do all of them at once." 62 was the year Nero chose to follow those words. Firstly, in 62, Burrus died. With it went one of Nero's keys to power. He put another man in that place, who I think is Tigellinus, but again, I'm bad at pronouncing things. Tigellinus, who would not do nearly as well as Burrus in that position. Nero would also appoint Lucius Rufus, something he would regret later. As a result of this, according to Tacitus at least, Seneca lost what little power he still had, although we do have a lot of evidence from Seneca's letters that he was at the very least still traveling with Nero and had some amount of official duties. So he clearly was still involved in the government in some respect. Supposedly, Seneca even went to Nero and requested that he be allowed to retire, but Nero refused him. Who knows if this even happened or not, but one thing that would make sense to me is Seneca is at this point the only person who is still around who's been there for Nero since his childhood. So it doesn't strike me as the weirdest thing in the world that a kid with these types of mommy issues might ask for his oldest and dearest advisor to still kind of stick around. Now, is that selfish? Yes, almost without a doubt. But again, we're talking about Nero here. And I think when it came to family and his power, he was a little bit too paranoid, and that would lead to some of these things. I would have loved it if my version of the story was Nero did nothing wrong and was a perfect ruler. But that's just not what I found. There were also a few trials concerning loyalty to the emperor around this time. The first was Anstanticius Serranus in 61 or 62 AD. Supposedly he'd written some poems kind of mocking Nero, and so he was going to be put to death. However, Teresa Paetus, a strong rival of Nero at the time, instead said that the death penalty was too harsh for this man, and he should instead be remitted to just exile. He apparently was convincing enough to sway the majority of the Senate to his side, and so the matter was referred to Nero. Nero claimed that he would have intervened himself had the Senate sentenced him to death, and so said that their ruling was fine, and that they could even acquit him if they felt so inclined. He was, of course, exiled, but I do think this paints an interesting picture of Nero again. Supposedly he's this megalomaniac who couldn't stand criticism and didn't listen to anyone. But here, when there's a trial of someone supposedly mocking Nero, he kind of just says, it's fine, let the guy go. Now, Tacitus is actually a bit more cynical here, saying that this whole thing was a farce set up so that Nero could come in and show himself to be such a generous and kind sovereign and reduce this man's sentence after the Senate had sentenced him to death. And that Paetus had essentially just kind of like jumped in and sort of spoiled the fun by saying we shouldn't sentence him to death. And so kind of stole Nero's thunder, and he was upset about that. So there is that version of events if you really want to hate Nero. Regardless, Socianus was spared. Unfortunately, several other people this year would not be so lucky. One of them being Nero's first wife. Now, Nero had several loves during his reign, but as we touched on briefly, in the late 50s and early 60s, he fell in love with a woman named Poppaea Sabina. When Poppaea and Nero met, she was married to Otho, her second husband at the time. Otho and Nero were actually great friends at the time, and in the Civil War after Nero's death, Otho would be the second to take power from Nero's usurper. Poppaea would divorce Otho in 59 or 58 AD, and then would marry Nero in 62. By the way, if you feel bad for Otho getting cucked by the emperor, just note that A, this is far from the worst case of that happening, and B, he would later return the favor when, after Nero died, he took up concubinage with Sporus, who was Nero's husband at the time of his death. Dio relates that Poppaea encouraged Nero to divorce Octavia. It's not completely out of the realm of possibility. Again, there were 3 years where they were clearly together. However, Octavia was still a very important key to Nero's power. Yet in the 8 years of marriage, they hadn't had a single child. As some of the historians relate to us, Nero really seemed to want a child. In 62, however, Poppaea became pregnant and Nero divorced Octavia. Nero very clearly loved Poppaea. This is something not only all the ancient writers agree on, but we can even see in the number of statues and coins made of her. And so it would make sense that basically a woman he loves finally falls pregnant, and now suddenly he realizes he's going to have a child and he can be with the woman he loves, and so he divorces a woman that he doesn't really love much at all. And this is where Nero's paranoia rears its ugly head. After the divorce, Octavia was also supposedly accused of adultery. Due to this, Nero banished her as well. But remember, Octavia was actually quite popular, so when she was banished, they actually began protesting. Now, a rumor went out that Nero had apparently changed his mind and was going to let Octavia come back. And basically a riot broke out, more akin to the our team just won the Super Bowl or World Cup for my non-American viewers kind of riot than an, I'm unhappy kind of riot. They stormed the palace and tore down statues of Poppaea that had been put up and, were cheering and laying laurels around Nero. And Nero essentially sent the palace guard out to disperse them. And now it gets tricky again. According to Tacitus, Poppaea told Nero that pretty much anyone at this point could remarry Octavia and have a claim to the throne. This sort of makes sense. One of Nero's main claims to the throne was that he was married to Octavia. She was only 22 at the time, so what was to stop someone else from marrying her and doing the same thing Nero did? Think, too, how popular Nero was with the people, and seeing the people turn on him over exiling his ex-wife probably did a number on him and reared that ugly paranoia of his again. In light of all this, it makes sense that he would eventually have Octavia executed as an easy way of dealing with a potential political rival. Now, I'm not condoning this. All I'm saying is the picture I'm painting of Nero, I can see this action occurring. However, I really don't think he had to do this. I really do think he overstepped, and that he essentially just let this absolute fear of ever losing his power make him go farther than he probably had to. And I'd also imagine that him taking an action like this did a lot to hurt him, not just with the people, but probably with the Senate as well. Another interesting thing to note is Octavia, in addition to having a brother Britannicus, dead at this point, still had one living relative, another sister named Antonia. Now, Antonia would interestingly be implicated in a later conspiracy that we're going to get to in a bit, but she would not be executed as a result of that conspiracy. To me, this lends a bit more credence to my paranoia theory. In this instance, Nero, seeing his waning popularity, kind of freaked out and took an action he didn't necessarily have to take. But with this other sister, when he has a bit more space and he can think a bit more clearly, doesn't take that action. Also, fun fact, the only Roman historical drama which survives to us is Octavia. telling the story of the last days of Octavia, as well as Seneca and Nero a little bit. So I'll link that if you want to read it as well. Probably a lot of stuff in there didn't actually happen, and it does paint Nero as a completely mad tyrant, but it's just sort of interesting to read a play that was basically written, probably within 50 years after this event happened. So for this one, while the details may be up for debate, Nero did kill his wife, and there likely wasn't much of a reason to do so, aside from some supposed ideas of potential conspiracy.
Actually, late in editing, I found a few people talking about how Octavia may not have been as innocent as Tacitus paints her, but this is a very small minority of scholars, so I'm going to link them in the companion doc if you want to read. It boils down to analyzing one line in Tacitus where she's accused of treason and had earlier been getting close to Agrippina. But I remain unconvinced because we know Poppaea was pregnant around the time of the divorce, and that just makes more sense to me.
I think this is a good place to look at the character of Nero that's taking shape here. He's not perfect. And sure, I was really hoping when I started this research it would be a Nero did nothing wrong video, because that's interesting, and then I can clickbait the title and the thumbnail and all that fun stuff. But when I did the research, what I found was just person. I still think better than history has painted him, but certainly a very flawed individual who made some pretty serious missteps. He also was handed the empire at a pretty terrible time, all things considered, but still, he didn't make the best of it the way other emperors would. Regardless, a few more executions happened in 62, notably from other possible claimants to the throne. One of the men exiled was Plautus, who again had already been exiled and was accused of fomenting sedition in the provinces, and the other was Faustus Cornelius Sulla Felix, who was another person who potentially had a claim to the throne through the Julio-Claudians.
Tacitus does actually lend a bit of credence to Plautus fomenting sedition, but he mostly places it on to Gellinus kind of feeding into Nero's paranoia. And the other ancient writers just say he did it for basically no reason.
Also, a bit more spurious, but Octavia, a play that is decidedly unfavorable towards Nero, actually seems to confirm they were inciting sedition. This would also line up with the Senate posthumously expelling them, recorded in Tacitus.
There's also an odd story with Plautus that is a trope that repeats several times with different people, depending on which historian you're listening to, where Nero takes the head of his enemies and then mocks them or gifts them to Poppaea or any other number of things. The problem is, even under the best conditions with the fastest travel possible, it would have taken at least 2 weeks to get the head from the execution site back to Nero. The human body starts decomposing pretty quickly. Now, Romans weren't unaware of preservation methods. They could have mummified it or put it in salt or any other number of things. I'm just saying it feels a little weird, especially when the thing Nero's supposed to comment on is Plautus having a very large nose. The nose, which probably would have been one of the first things to rot. But I do worry at times that I lean too much into, well, that's not what I think Nero would have done. So I'm happy to give it to him. Maybe Nero did actually do this and mock the guy's head. In which case, point to the Nero as a tyrant camp.
So again, this is Nero doing a lot of bad in one fell swoop. For Octavia, at the very least, I do think he overstepped his bounds. In 63, not a whole lot happened, but Poppaea did finally give birth to Nero's first child, a daughter whom he named Claudia. Nero threw great celebrations and awarded both his wife and his daughter the titles of Augusta. However, sadly, months later, his child Claudia would die. So let's move on to 64 AD, when Nero took the stage and Rome burned. Up until now, Nero had never performed publicly. However, sometime after his Neronia, Nero had clearly become smitten with the stage, going so far as to even training his voice and body so that he could perform better. So in 64, Nero decided he'd trained enough and it was finally time for him to present himself to the public. He chose Naples as the place to do this due to its history as a Greek colony. Supposedly, his performance there went extremely well. Now, Tacitus and Suetonius tell us this only happened because Nero effectively paid the audience. But we have plenty of other sources telling us that Nero's performances were actually widely enjoyed. Pliny the Younger even writing that everyone loved his performances. So make of it what you will. Nero would return to Rome and, again, according to the sources we have, throw many lavish feasts and parties. And it was at one of these lavish feasts that Nero would marry his freedman Pythagoras, with Nero playing the role of the bride. Suetonius tells us that he married someone else named Doryphorus, but apparently this is an easy mistake to make with how Pythagoras is written in Greek. But I know Greek way, way less than I know Latin. So that's what I see people say, and I'll link some stuff in the companion doc. if you do know Greek, let me know if this makes sense to you. Now, my last video was basically all about being gay in ancient Rome. And so naturally, I talked a lot about male-male marriage ceremonies that we have evidence of. So it's not exactly like these things were unheard of. However, in this instance, I actually don't think it happened at all. Firstly, Nero was supposedly married at this point, and well, sure, you could pretty easily just dismiss that and say, well, he's the emperor, he can have 2 wives. I mean, Caligula had 2 wives. I would counter with the fact that Nero really seemed to love Poppaea. We already went over how much he celebrated when his daughter was born, and the fact that he'd divorce Octavia, threatening his own power for her, I think also speaks a lot to how deep this love went. There's more evidence we'll get to in the later section as well, but it just strikes me as odd that Nero would denigrate the marriage to a woman he loves so much by taking on another spouse at the same time. We even have a later philosopher mention Nero's debaucheries in a discourse, and he makes special focus on Nero's relationship with Sporus, a boy who he would take as his husband, with Sporus playing the pathic or passive role. Yet, that philosopher doesn't mention Pythagoras even once. This entire episode just feels very out of character for Nero. The only way Pythagoras makes any sort of sense is if you're trying to build up to some really great event where Nero is particularly outrageous or goes particularly out of his way, or even... The Great Fire of Rome was undoubtedly the single biggest turning point for Nero, and was 100% the thing that led to his eventual dethronement. However, there's so much misinformation about this, and I don't have time to tackle everything, so I'm really just gonna focus on some of the small stuff and then the big stuff after.
Dio and Suetonius do tell us Nero was in Rome the night it burned, just disagreeing on his precise location, saying he was either on top of a certain tower or on top of the palace itself, and singing in both instances. However, their stories don't super make sense, as the 2 locations they name both would have gone up in flames that same night, according to Tacitus's account of how the fire spread. And given Nero didn't burn to death, I, and many other scholars, are a bit skeptical of these claims. Tacitus says he was at Antium, which most modern scholars agree with. But there's an interesting note so far as Nero performing while Rome burned.
Tacitus notes, and even he says it might have been a rumor, that Nero was actually performing the night that Rome burned, and supposedly he may have sung something called the Fall of Troy. So there is something to the fact that Nero may have been performing while Rome burned, but if he was, it was completely unrelated to the burning itself. If you were really determined to hate Nero, your 3 main claims would probably be: 1, Nero set the fire; 2, Nero profited off the fire and used it to rebuild Rome in his image; and 3, Nero blamed the Christians and heavily persecuted them for it. So let's look at what we got. First is Suetonius' account. This is a really, really short account, which basically just says that someone remarked, "When I die, let the world be consumed by fire." And then Nero says, "No, while I live," and then burns Rome down. Which makes sense. Ultimately, Suetonius claims it was in order to expand his palace. And Nero was so bold about this, he actually sent out agents in the middle of the night armed with torches onto the estates of senators whom he wanted to seize their property. And the senators were too scared of Nero at this point to even stop these guys and just let them burn their place down. Tacitus gives us a larger and a bit more detailed retelling. According to Tacitus, the fire sprang up in shops where flammable goods were stored near the Circus Maximus, or the very large amphitheater in Rome. Not that one, actually. It was a different one. As the night progressed, the wind picked up, and that really pushed the fire out to the rest of the city. It would burn for 6 days and go out, and then come back and burn for another 3 days. Rome had 14 districts at the time, and in all, 3 were completely razed, 7 were heavily damaged, and only 4 were lightly damaged or escaped damage altogether. In some of these accounts from Tacitus, when the fire started, basically everyone realized how bad it was, and so they packed up and ran. What people saw was a bunch of people darting in and out of the burning building. And when some people went to try and put out the fire, these people would stop them. Some accounts also say these people were looting. Some people point to this as like these were Nero's agents stopping people from fighting the fire, but I mean, it just feels a lot more logical that these were just looters taking advantage, and they didn't want people to put out the fire because then, you know, you might be able to stay in your home, and they wanted to just rob people. So I don't know. Again, it really depends on how badly you want to hate Nero at this point. As for Nero's actions, again, in Tacitus's account, which is the only one that talks about Nero in any real detail, though Nero is informed of the fire quite early, he doesn't actually come back until the fire has reached his palace. This doesn't make sense for a couple reasons. Nero, as with all emperors, traveled with a fairly large retinue, so he couldn't just pack up and leave at a moment's notice. He would have had to issue orders, and it probably would have taken at least a day. So it's possible this was just logistics. However, according to Tacitus's account of how the fire spread, it hit the palace basically that first night, and it continued to burn for 6 more days, and then 3 more after that. It would have been nearly impossible for a messenger to reach Nero before his palace had been lit on fire. We also know that Nero began relief efforts immediately upon his return to Rome. So it's possible that before he left, he had to send out a bunch of letters and messengers to the various people he would need to help him with those relief efforts, as obviously no one in Rome could help him. He had temporary structures rapidly built, and when that wasn't enough, he even opened the imperial properties so that all the refugees could simply stay there instead. In addition, he cleared all corpses and rubble from the city free of charge. He may have even been helping to put the fires out himself in some of the later nights. Tacitus later telling us Nero was rushing unguarded from place to place in the night. This all sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Well, there is another way you can interpret these things, and it's not quite as charitable. You could choose to see Nero as a wicked opportunist here, in that Tacitus relates to us a rumor spread that he sang about the fall of Troy while Rome was burning. So people may have looked at this as Nero having some foreknowledge of the fire, at the very least. Lastly, after the fire, Nero supposedly built the Dominus Aurea, or the Golden House. We'll get into this a bit more later, but it was a very large house covered in gold and jewels. And this house would continue to be the seat of imperial power for a very long time, though much of the gold and jewels would be stripped by later emperors. In addition, it wasn't a single building, it was a complex of buildings. And some scholars argue that some of the parks in the middle were actually supposed to be open to the public, and that perhaps Nero was trying to build some sort of art park that people could come in and visit. Regardless of whether or not you buy that, that's kind of beside the point. Because while that may sound nice, imagine having your house and all your belongings destroyed in a fire. And maybe you do get a new house from Nero, which is cool and all, but then you see this giant, shining gold and jewel-encrusted house in the distance. That's just kind of going to make you feel a certain type of way. And even if he then does say, no, it's cool, you could come in and visit like certain parts of it if you want sometimes, that just kind of feels like rubbing salt in the wound. This coupled with a rumor that maybe was going around at the time, maybe wasn't actually going around until later, that Nero wanted to rebuild Rome in his own image as Neropolis, really did seem to show that there was some tension starting to form around this time. But that's basically the whole timeline. So let's take a look at those earlier claims and see what we can figure out about them. So 1, Nero starting the fire. I feel like we've been over a lot of this, but most of the evidence I've seen indicates the opposite. The strongest evidence for Nero starting the fire is a lot of accounts that fires seem to spring up that weren't directly in the path of the fire. However, one thing I came across in my research, by the way, I just want to interrupt myself. This stuff's really fun because, I'm like trying to learn about Nero, and I end up learning about like ancient Roman poisons and like how fires spread and stuff like that. Like this is really fun for me. I hope you're enjoying it because this stuff is just really fun for me to just dig into like this. Anyway, one thing I came across in my research is that the way fires spread sometimes looks like that. Basically, fires will create a lot of updraft because they're sucking in a lot of oxygen, and then obviously the air on top of the fire is hotter than the air to the sides of the fire, so lower pressure, yada, yada, yada. So basically, they're going to suck all the air up, and sometimes what happens as a result is those burning embers will get sucked all the way up. And then some wind can come and blow the ember along, it'll fall somewhere else, and especially in a windy environment, that ember will then start a new fire in that area. So to someone who didn't have this kind of knowledge, it's not unreasonable to think, wow, someone clearly is running around setting these extra fires. But it does seem like not only is this possible, but this is actually somewhat common in terms of how fires spread. So this makes sense why everyone at the time thought that. And then again, later historians were heavily incentivized to blame Nero for this. So Nero probably didn't start the fire. It probably had already been burning since the world's been turning. 2. Nero used the fire as an excuse to rob the city blind. Again, unlikely. We know that Nero was already fabulously wealthy, and at this time at least, he wasn't terribly strapped for cash. Now, what did end up happening was Nero had to basically pay to completely rebuild the city of Rome, a very expensive prospect. In order to do this, from what we know from historians and other evidence, Nero raised taxes on the outlying provinces. This was ultimately a very bad call. On its face, it makes sense, right? You need to rebuild the city of Rome, and you need to rebuild these temples to the gods, and to do that, you need to get money from somewhere. Nero also instituted price controls on grain and wine, a fairly necessary thing given that most of the citizens of Rome couldn't work at this point. However, again, that's even more money that you now need to get from somewhere. And again, where are you going to get it from? The provinces. Couple that with what I mentioned earlier. The economy was already in trouble. And indeed, when Nero was eventually deposed, it started with rebellions in these far-flung provinces that had basically been taxed to all get out up to this point. Part of Nero's story as a tyrant would start here, demanding people thousands of miles away pay an inordinate amount of taxes when they're already struggling just to help people they'd never met. Now, to Nero's credit, his reconstruction of Rome has been generally lauded. Everything from the layout of the streets to some of the public buildings he built, such as markets and baths. Tacitus himself, again writing like 60-ish years after the event, would write about the striking beauty of the re-arisen city, while still lamenting what was lost. Nero also implemented building codes used to make the city more fireproof going forward, including the use of non-flammable construction materials, porches to allow fighting fires to be easier, and height restrictions on apartments. But all of this, again, would cost a ton of money. It was all really, really good ideas. It just probably wasn't the time to do any of them. We know from Nero's debasement the economy was already in quite a bit of trouble. But what we can see from Vespasian's actions barely 2 years after Nero's death, things really did not seem to get better after this. 3. Nero blamed the Christians and persecuted them harshly. Okay, so this one's a bit of a toss-up. Firstly, we know Nero cracked down on Jewish rights, and Christians, not even 40 years old at this point, would likely have still been considered Jews. Secondly, when you have a bunch of people who have just lost their jobs and houses, you kind of need to give them some form of entertainment, or they're probably just going to turn to rioting. Public executions and gladiator games and things like this would have made sense as a way to placate the populace. Lastly, later Christians hated Nero. Some postulate he might have been the Antichrist that Paul spoke about. So why do I say this is a toss-up then? Well, because when we look at the evidence that we have, a lot of it doesn't really hold up under scrutiny. Firstly, the only real mention we have of this happening comes from Tacitus. Suetonius also mentions that Nero cracked down on Christians, but notably doesn't relate it to the Great Fire. While Tacitus and Dio have the only clear records of the fire, we do have some tangential references from people like Pliny the Elder, who also does not mention Christians. Secondly, we have later Christian writers, writing hundreds of years after Tacitus, who notably don't mention a persecution of Christians following the Great Fire. One of the best examples of this comes from around 300 AD, Lecantus's On the Deaths of the Persecutors, in which he goes into great detail about everyone who ever persecuted the Christians ever. Now, he has a whole section on Nero and even relates to us a brand new story where Nero apparently razed a Christian temple to the ground. But notably, he never mentions the Great Fire in any context. In fact, the Great Fire leading to a persecution of Christians wouldn't be mentioned again until nearly 400 AD. And lastly, the term Christian would not really be in common parlance until at least the year 100 AD. This is a little earlier than Tacitus and Suetonius were writing, and of course way after Nero had died. Interestingly, Tacitus, in his earlier work, The Histories, which confusingly covers a later period of history than the Annals, does mention Judea, but he never mentions the Christians at all. Josephus also tells us that Poppaea, Nero's wife at the time, was very sympathetic to the plight of the Jews and would often intercede on their behalf with Nero, leading to a softening of some of his harsher policies. So this leads us to an obvious question. Why did Tacitus claim this, especially if no one else did? The arguments basically boil down to Christian being a backdated anachronism, something that we know Tacitus would often do. One of the issues of Tacitus using a term like this is Nero wouldn't have known about the term at the time. How would Nero have known the difference between Christians and just Jews? Compare this similarly to when Suetonius relates to us that Claudius, the emperor before Nero, had expelled Jews from the city of Rome because they were causing trouble due to the teachings of Christ. But importantly, not a separate group. They were still considered Jewish, and therefore Jews as a whole were banned. Even in Paul's letter to the Romans, written about 10 years before the Great Fire, he sends greetings to several people in Rome who were following Christ like him. But importantly, he refers to himself as Jewish, because the distinction wasn't super clear to people outside of Judaism at the time. Paul was also put on trial in
Achaia
around 52 by other Jews claiming he was being heretical, whereupon the magistrate basically says, well, I don't know what you want me to do. This sounds like an internal conflict among Jews. Again, showing that there wasn't a clear distinction between Christians and Jews in the minds of Romans at that time. So this already begins to smell a little fishy. To put it another way, why wouldn't Nero have thrown out all the Jews? And even if he did want to target this one hyper-specific sect, how would he have known how to differentiate it at the time? Yet if all that doesn't convince you, let's look at one of the other early accounts of Christianity from non-Christian sources, Pliny the Younger's letter to Trajan. In this letter, which I'll link, is actually quite interesting to read, he's asking Trajan for guidance on what to do about Christians, as Pliny is unsure what to do.
He's not sure what they believe, he's not sure why they're problematic, and he's never read or witnessed any trials of Christians. And this letter is from about 50 years after the Great Fire, but notably doesn't mention anything about Nero or any edicts he may have published about Christians in the wake of it.
It just seems that this is quite a lot to hang on the words of a single source, especially when Nero never really engages in this kind of behavior from any other source that we can find. So again, there isn't a ton of evidence one way or another. I'm still pretty on the fence. Much like with Britannicus, I guess I lean slightly towards maybe he didn't do this, but it really would not take much to push me back the other way. Really, the things holding me back are the fact that there isn't really any smoking gun, and further than that, there isn't even smoke where there should be. So those kind of things give me pause. But this one's more up to you to read and decide for yourself what you think. And when it rains, it truly pours, because as a result of this, a plague would break out, killing, according to one source, at least 30,000 people. And again, something like that is just going to ferment dissent. And again, is going to be very expensive when you think about all the sick houses you're going to have to build. So just more and more costs keep piling up in a world where the main treasury was already kind of hand to mouth, with the emperor needing to support it, and suddenly there's just no money. And indeed, Suetonius claims that Nero's popularity really started to wane here, that graffiti popped up all over the city denigrating Nero, even though he went to great lengths to ensure that these people weren't prosecuted and no one even tried to find them. Again, who knows how much we can trust this source, but given everything that's happened, waning popularity doesn't really feel out of place. So let's move on, because 65 was a real banger of a year. At this point, I think we've pretty firmly established that Nero likely wasn't the mad tyrant that he is depicted as. But 65 is where some of those stories start making a bit more sense, because 65 is where Nero really ramps up his killing. But it's not completely out of left field, because 65 is when we finally get to the Pisonian Conspiracy. In a year after the Great Fire, several prominent senators, knights, and soldiers got together to try and put Gaius Calpurnius Piso on the throne. Tacitus even relates to us that while Piso was more handsome and better spoken than Nero, he shared many of his debaucherous tendencies, including performing on the stage, which supports my previous video, but also leads us to a really interesting question. Why did men support this guy over Nero? It doesn't seem to have been over Nero's disgraces or debaucheries. If anything, it does seem to have a lot more to do with his tyranny, which, for me at least, I interpret as, again, these higher taxes. Tacitus even saying that these men desire no strictness in their head of state. And so actually this may have been kind of what I've been hinting at, that the economy is the reason for this conspiracy. And also keep in mind, this is the first conspiracy of Nero's entire reign. coming 11 years after he took the throne. Also, like 3 out of the 4 main conspirators, Tacitus claims it was just like artistic feuding. Like one of them was just mad that Nero had stifled his poems, and another was mad that, Nero had kind of mocked him in a poem. So silly stuff, but you could see the companion doc for more detailed info on that. They gather a few people to their cause and eventually are talking about how to do it and decide to do it with a dagger. So they send a freedman to go sharpen the dagger, and he reports it to Nero, who basically has them all arrested and immediately tortured and questioned. But the big blow here is one of the members of the conspiracy was Seneca. Caveat, maybe. Now, in Dio's account, it's pretty straightforward, but Dio also really hated Seneca for some reason. He gives us a lot of stuff that no one else ever mentions about him, so I don't know how much we can trust him on that. Tacitus is the only account to go out of his way to explicitly state that Seneca wasn't involved in this conspiracy. But he then goes on later to say that the soldiers were planning on replacing Piso with Seneca once Piso had taken the throne, and says that Seneca was aware of this. So at the very least, Tacitus is implying Seneca knew about a plan to kill Nero and didn't do anything, which is still pretty bad. As much as I keep talking about how paranoid Nero is, and I firmly believe he was very paranoid, I don't think that's what's going on with the Seneca thing. It really just seems like, Seneca had betrayed Nero. And just think about what that would do to Nero. Seneca at this point is the last person from Nero's childhood, the last person who had really, lifted him up when he was younger and possibly even introduced him to his love of the arts. Seeing this guy go out of his way to essentially wish you dead might have hurt Nero even more than his mother. Seneca was actually even exiled under the previous emperor, Claudius. Now, if you remember, he had been recalled and placed as Nero's tutor by Agrippina. And also recall that according to Tacitus and also Dio, Seneca was aware of Nero's assassination plot and either supported it or at the very least didn't speak against it. So this might not be the first time Seneca bit the hand that was feeding him. Regardless, for me, I think at a bare minimum, Seneca knew of the conspiracy and didn't do anything to stop it, which makes Nero's decision to execute him not really something a tyrant would do. If anything, it's something that Seneca would recommend he do. Tacitus also relates to us that Seneca's wife basically wanted to join him. Seneca initially tells her no, but then when he sees she's made up for it, says, well, who am I to deny you? Nero, apparently, when he found out about that, prevented her by binding up her wounds. Tacitus also edges us incredibly hard by saying that as Seneca was dying, he gave his final discourse, which Tacitus will not reproduce, and that doesn't survive to us. We have no idea what it said or what it was, so that's... Boy, is that great. Boy, is that great.
Regardless, it's interesting to me that Tacitus goes out of his way to tell the story of Seneca's wife being saved by Nero, sort of showing Nero's compassion in a way. However, he then goes on to say that actually Seneca's wife might have wanted that, and that she actually secretly was scared of dying and just kind of wanted the appearance of going along with Seneca. So he kind of bends over backwards to try and make Nero look as bad as humanly possible.
Suetonius, by the way, actually barely mentions the conspiracy, just saying it was the earliest and most dangerous of Nero's conspiracies, and then just later mentions that Nero just drove Seneca to end himself. Nothing specifically relating to the Pisonian Conspiracy. So
Tacitus, interestingly, also relates to us here that people spread rumors that there had been no conspiracy, that it was actually just Nero trying to get money or being jealous of these people. He then goes on to say, however, that people who were exiled under Nero and then returned after were able to confirm this conspiracy took place. Couple this with Suetonius and Tacitus's accounts that Nero never actually cracked down on people spreading these rumors or saying negative things about Nero. To me, this paints a pretty clear picture of an emperor who let these rumors swirl around, and then when later emperors came to power who didn't like Nero and wanted to distance themselves from him, would propagate these rumors as fact. Couple this with overly high taxes making everyone outside of Rome, as well as the wealthy within Rome, dislike Nero, and you have a recipe for falsehoods to be pushed this way. Again, I do think Nero made mistakes. His paranoia, his lack of thinking through his solutions to problems, and ultimately not paying attention to the army certainly were part of his downfall. But I think the image of this mad tyrant might have just been the stuff of rumors swirling at the time. But let's keep going and see what the rest of his life looks like.
There are plenty of other people executed in this. And it's all just kind of the standard Tacitus thing. They first, they're accused of something, and then they resist it and say no, and then they get tortured, and then they eventually give in, and then they get to say some like badass line to Nero, like one guy's like, I did love you, but then you turned evil and now I don't. And then someone else, Nero's like, well, why do you want to kill me? And he's like, because it's the only service I could render your many infamies. So I don't know, maybe everyone was Winston Churchill back in the day. I have no idea, but the whole thing strikes me as a bit too dramatic. Regardless, this also isn't that weird. If there's a conspiracy like to kill you, and you're the emperor, like, yeah, that's what you do. They get executed for that's kind of the deal you take when you shoot for the king, you best not miss. That's just how it works. This conspiracy really does start to mark the end of Nero's reign. It's the first public kind of uprising against him, and within 2 years, the final uprising against him would have started. At this point, it's pretty clear that Nero is running out of money pretty badly, not just from his own, but from the state as well. And from what we know from the guy who took over Galba after Nero was deposed, the treasury was basically completely empty, as were the imperial coffers. So this has the ring of truth to it, that Nero had essentially been overspending and had not really had enough to back it up. One kind of out for Nero here is supposedly someone showed up during this time and said, hey, there's a cavern on my property that's completely full of gold. I know it's there. I just need you to help me come and excavate it, and this could really help all your money problems. And Nero's, of course, thrilled, so he sends a bunch of guys to go help him. Tacitus tells us that this was just a dream the guy had that he presented as real, and it was obviously eventually found to be false. Suetonius instead tells us that he'd found caves filled with gold in like North Africa, and he just needed Nero to come help him carry the gold, but that also turns out to be false. Regardless, during this time period, the idea is that Nero thinks a bunch of gold is coming, so he spends a bunch of money sort of on credit almost. And when that other money doesn't come in, he's sort of over a barrel.
And Nero choosing to spend before he actually has the gold, in my opinion, is another one of his faults. Again, not thinking through things. If you want to go more towards the Nero was a tyrant camp, maybe he was simply deluding himself, or using this promise as an excuse to spend when he knew he was about to run out of money either way. And if you want to give it more towards the Nero did nothing wrong camp, maybe he truly believed that he was favored by the gods and this was some sort of divine intervention.
Interestingly, Suetonius tells us that it was getting so bad, Nero actually stripped the gold and silver from the temples of the gods. Tacitus kind of uses this story to paint a picture of a fool who has wasted all his money, especially as this coincided with the Second Quinquennial Games in 65, where again, Nero handed out a bunch of prizes, supposedly because he thought he had a bunch of gold coming. Nero was again really well received at these games. His performances were really approved of. However, again, that's not really the problem that was facing the empire at this time, was a lack of entertainment. The important thing to remember here is Nero is spending a lot of money, and not just his own, but potentially even money from the public treasury at this point. Now, keep in mind, Nero had already been propping up the public treasury for basically his entire life. But now, with all the extra construction and everything going on, basically just everything on both ends was drained to zero. At this time, the populace was kept happy by bread and circuses. The army was kept happy by being paid. And the nobles were kept happy by lower taxes and more privileges. Unfortunately, all of those things basically cost money. Suetonius even relates to us that occasionally the coffers were so low, Nero would have to postpone paying the soldiers. Sort of a like, we're skipping this paycheck, but don't worry, you'll get paid on the next one. This is a really easy way to get deposed. Nero probably should have focused on the soldiers to the exclusion of all else. But Nero never really seemed to care much for the army, and clearly always had a soft spot for, if not the populace, at least the applause that they gave him. So while I can understand why he chose this, he still chose wrong. Very wrong. Also in 65, Nero was accused of kicking Poppaea, his second wife, to death, while she was pregnant nonetheless. Suetonius' account is Nero was coming home late from the races, and Poppaea kind of nagged him. He got in a fight with her and just kind of kicked her out of anger, and she died. Suetonius does still claim, though, that he loved her dearly. Tacitus's account is it was a random outburst of anger from Nero that led to him kicking his wife. He also points out that while some people have rumors of poison, Tacitus doesn't buy those rumors, as he points out that Nero dearly loved Poppaea and again really wanted more children. Which, again, is Nero not cracking down on rumors or disrespect from the commoners. Dio also notes it was random, but says it may have even been an accident, though he doesn't really say anything else about it. And again, these are epitomes from a later Christian priest, so these might have been elisions, and these also might have just been total additions. However, as we've already been over, Nero dearly loved Poppaea. She was even able to influence him on certain policy decisions. And indeed, after he died, he married 2 other people who were both said to look like her. And at his funeral, Pliny relates to us that he burned basically a year's worth of incense. So this was clearly a woman he loved very dearly. I just can't see him kicking one of the first women he's ever loved to death, especially when she's carrying his child, even by accident. I guess you could chalk this up to some sort of paranoia where he thought she was going to, kill him or whatever. But I would counter with the fact that this was like the 60s AD, and it's far more likely she just died in childbirth.
We even have a poem recently uncovered and written about 200 years after Nero's death. Though fragmented, it tells the story of Poppaea ascending to heaven, all the while begging the gods to let her stay with Nero. It even describes Nero as someone equal to the gods. So again, much more evidence the other way.
So again, I'm with camp Nero did nothing wrong here. The British Museum also did an exhibit on Nero back in the day that was curated by Mary Beard, whose book, The 12 Caesars, was one of the first things I read when I was preparing for this, as I'd loved her earlier book as PQR. And in that exhibit, she claims that kicking your pregnant wife to death was sort of a literary trope that mad tyrants were known to do throughout history. Tropes do pop up like this in historical writings from the ancient and classical periods all the time. After all, these were often commissioned, and the old adage of don't let the truth stand in the way of a good story was certainly well embraced back then. But again, I'll link it and you can make up your own mind. But make up your mind quick, because we're moving on to... Let's start with the last real political victory of Nero's career. If you remember way back early in this video, I mentioned that Nero had crowned a client king of Armenia named Tigranes. Upon being named king, he almost immediately invaded a few states on the edge of the Parthian Empire that he claimed were still Armenian.
To make a very long story short, Tigranes starts a war. There are 2 generals, one good one and one bad one. Rome loses the war because of the bad one. The Parthians send an envoy to sue for peace to Rome. Rome didn't know that they'd lost the war, and so they reject the terms of the peace and send it back, giving all the control of the troops to the good general. Then, when the Parthians see the good general coming, they decide to sue for peace on more reasonable terms. The ultimate outcome was Armenia would be ruled by a Parthian, but that Parthian would have to be chosen and crowned by Rome.
So in 66, Nero crowns Tiridates as the new king of Armenia and closes the ceremonial gates of Janus, which were essentially gates that were opened when Rome was at war and closed when it was at peace. And Nero claimed there was an eternal peace throughout the empire that would never be broken, and even had a few coins struck. Now, some senators did seem to dislike the peace, but on the whole, it seemed like most people were actually happy. Nero was even hailed imperator by his troops. And after Nero died, the Parthians begged the Senate to still give Nero his full due honors. And years later, when an imposter would rise claiming to be Nero, he would actually be sheltered by them. And they would hold on to him until Rome basically threatened to invade if they didn't give him back. So clearly Nero had won the respect of his opponents in this regard.
But now for the bad. In 66 and 67, Nero would execute a lot of people. Suetonius relates to us that there was another failed conspiracy headed by Annius Ficinius, and so that execution seems justified to me. Dio also tells us of a few deaths, one where there are 2 brothers who are accused of something, but then they try and get an audience with Nero and they can't, so they just do themselves in. And then another one's a dancer that Nero tries to learn from, but can't, so he executes him. Dio also says that Nero had Corbulo executed around this time, who was the main general in the Armenia story. However, he was also the father-in-law of Ficinius, as well as related to many other people on the list that we're about to get to. He also claims Nero did this all for money, which is possible. Nero did need money right around now, but I'm more inclined to chalk this up to the type of rumors Tacitus claimed were spreading in the wake of the Pisonian Conspiracy. Tacitus lists quite a few more victims of Nero from during this time, and I'm just going to have to read them because I can't keep them all straight in my head. They are Silanus, Lucius Vetus and family, Publius Gallus, Publius Anteius, Ostorius Scapula, Aeneas Mela, Anicius Cerealis, Rufrius Crispinius, Titus Petronius, Cilia, Minusinius Thermus, Barus Soranus, and Thracia Paetus. But let's examine each of these deaths, keeping in mind that Tacitus is our only source for most of these. Silanus and Cassius were supposedly exiled by the Senate and then executed by Nero for treason. They had paid respects to a bust of Cassius's ancestor who had plotted against Caligula that had been inscribed at the bottom with "to the leader of the cause." The implication being that they were harboring similar sentiments about Nero. Lucius Vetus was the father-in-law of Plautus, who had earlier been executed for treason. Tacitus claims that Nero already had a deep-seated hatred of them, but when one of his freedmen says that he had also been plotting against Nero and had just gotten away with it up until now, Nero merely used that as an excuse, full well knowing that it was a trumped-up charge. However, Tacitus will claim almost all of these are trumped up charges, so I don't know how much stock we can put in that. Publius Gallus, same deal. Treason accused by freedmen. Overall, though, it's pretty light on the details, so not much to go on here. Publius Anteius and Ostorius Scapula were accused by Antistius Socianus, who, recall, was exiled by Nero earlier for writing poems attacking the emperor. Supposedly, he intercepted a letter to an astrologer that he used as proof to claim that the two of them were looking into Nero's future and plotting against him, and so they were executed. It's possible it's true, it's possible it's not, but if Nero fell for the fake gold thing, it seems like he might fall for this as well. Aeneas Mela, Anicius Cerealis, Rufrius Crispinius, and Titus Petronius all met their ends as well. Crispinius had been the head of the Praetorian Guard prior to Burrus. Yes, way back before Nero was emperor. He'd been removed by Agrippina and replaced because he had favored Britannicus to take the throne. He had gone on to serve as a senator. Now, if you go to Wikipedia, it'll say that Nero banished him because he just hated him, and then a year later just had him executed without providing any real reason. But that's not what Tacitus claims at all. Not to mention that senators were appointed by the consuls, who, at this point in time, were themselves appointed by the emperor. So his position in the Senate was likely only due to the pleasure of Nero to begin with. That doesn't sound like he hated the guy. Tacitus does initially say that Crispinius was banished and then later took his own life when he received a letter pronouncing his death sentence. But if you keep reading, you'll understand why, and why all four of those guys were mentioned together. So Mela was the father of Lucan, one of the leaders of the Pisonian Conspiracy. Tacitus claims that after Mela called in some debts, one of his debtors came forward and accused him of also being aware of the Pisonian Conspiracy and not telling Nero, kind of like Seneca. The accuser even presented Nero with a letter, which Tacitus claimed was a forgery, and Nero then sent the letter to Mela, who then supposedly just immediately takes his own life, which, if truly a trumped up charge, seems like a bit of an overreaction, especially when his son, who certainly did conspire to kill Nero, resisted torture for a little while first. Anyway, in his will, he claims that it's unfair that he's being put to death, while two other previously unnamed members of the Pisonian Conspiracy still draw breath, Cerealis and Crispinius. So that's why Crispinius was executed later, because he was accused of being involved in the conspiracy. Now, I do want to note this addition to his will may have been spurious, or Tacitus's implication here might have been that Nero added this himself to just get rid of these people. So again, if you want to hate Nero, there's plenty of evidence if you want to do that. Petronius is a bit of a weird one though. Supposedly he actually got pretty close with Nero, and then Tigellinus got jealous, I'm very sorry, about their relationship, and so trumped up a charge of him also being involved in the Pisonian Conspiracy. But Nero wasn't even there when he was executed, so it's unclear if Nero had even given the order. But given his paranoia and how many other conspirators were coming out of the woodwork around this time, I don't find it unreasonable that Nero may have done this, and in doing so, done an unjust execution. There's also kind of a funny story that his will, which he sent directly to Nero, was just a list of everyone Nero had banged and how he banged them. So, if true, base. Nero then executes Minutius Thermus for certain charges, so kind of tough to know what went on there, and exiled a senator's wife named Cilia because she had supposedly been spreading rumors about his sex life, which yes, tyrannical if true. Barus Serranus is again an accusation of treason, although Tacitus paints his as certainly false, even describing this scene in the Senate where he's under trial and his daughter's also being accused, and he breaks down crying and tries to run to his daughter and say there's no way she could have been involved, and then people trying to block him. So maybe. Paetus, though, is a bit more interesting. Paetus had actually been a character in Nero's story several times up to this point. If you remember, he notably was the guy who talked that one guy's death sentence into exile that Nero may have been upset with. He was a Stoic and is often talked about as the leader of the Stoic opposition under Nero. The Stoic opposition was not something that was exclusive to Nero. It was under a couple emperors, but was essentially just Stoic oppositions to the emperor. They seem to have had a bit of a back and forth relationship, with Nero barring him from certain activities, but then telling Seneca he'd actually made up with Paetus, and Seneca congratulating him on saving a worthwhile friendship. So he's sort of an interesting character up to this point in the story. At this point, he seems to be fairly directly resisting Nero, and Nero executes him. Tacitus paints this as Paetus had just resisted Nero for so long that Nero got tired of him and chose now to remove him. But there's an interesting parallel here between him and his eventual long-term successor, Vespasian. Funnily enough, the charge Nero had him executed under was not paying him his due honors. But when Vespasian would execute a different Stoic serving in the Senate for the exact same reason, Suetonius would paint it as Vespasian being incredibly broken up about this, in the end trying to call off the death sentence before it's carried out, but it's too late. Really interesting that you have the exact same thing happening with these two emperors, painted in radically different lights. Again, lending credence to the propaganda theory. So a lot of killings, and Tacitus paints almost all of them as completely trumped up charges. But if you accept that, you're left with two equally unlikely possibilities. Either Nero hated like half the Senate, but was too scared to move against them openly, and so just kept either making up charges or waiting for other people to make up charges to take care of these people, or he was just duped over and over. The other, more likely explanation to me is some of these were legitimate. Think about the political landscape in Rome at the time. Taxes have been hiked to high hell, and everyone's feeling the burden and wishing they could be freed from it. It's really tough to claim that every single one of these accusations was made up, because less than a year from this happening, the final uprising against Nero would begin. If I'm going to assume that Tacitus probably isn't right about all of these, it feels a little disingenuous to assume that Tacitus wasn't right about any of them. There was clearly a large faction in the Senate opposing Nero at this point, clearly demonstrated by their actions following his death, the removal of many of his statues and appointees, though a lot of these would be put back up under Otho.
Late in my research, I found there actually may have been quite a bit of senatorial opposition to the emperor, going all the way back to at least Caligula. I'm going to link an article by McAllenton which demonstrates there clearly was some level of senatorial resistance going on, but that it had to have started before Nero, and most were simply power-hungry claimants to the throne. No serious objection to the emperor themselves.
At the end of the day, I'm going to assume that this is a mixed bag. Some might go to Nero being a tyrant, and some might go to legitimate executions. I'll leave some resources in the companion doc, but you have to be the one to decide which of these executions might have been just and which might have been completely unfair. Around the time some of these were occurring, 66, 67-ish, Nero was in Greece to compete in the Olympics. Also, just a note, Tacitus's account of the reign of Nero is incomplete. The rest of it after this point is basically lost forever. So for the rest of Nero's reign, we have to rely on Suetonius, ever the salacious one, and Dio's abridged version. Supposedly, Nero bribed the Greek officials to actually move when the games were held so that he could attend all of them within the span of a single year. And from the records we have of the Arval Brotherhood of when Nero left Rome and when he competed in the games, this would make sense. So this seems true. Point for the Nero as a tyrant camp. Supposedly, he won every single contest he was in and cheated at several of them. My favorite being chariot racing, where he falls out of the chariot, but then is still awarded the laurel. And initially, I was sort of skeptical of this because we have that earlier claim that Nero was a stickler for the rules, from Suetonius nonetheless. But I was actually able to find one other account that said that Nero had won all the games, but instead of cheating said, of course he did. Who would dare win against the emperor? So it's also possible that everyone was too afraid to win against Nero. Potentially because of those rumors swirling around. So there's more evidence for this than against it at the very least. We'll never know, but the whole Olympic episode is a very strong argument for the Nero as a tyrant camp.
However, even if this was the case, it seems like the Greeks did like Nero. Not only did most of the fake Neros that arose after his death come from the East, but we even have Philostratus saying Nero oversaw a grand revival of Greek culture, greater than any previous age for Greece. Even later, Pausanias, in his description of Greece, would say in the Temple of Olympia there were still offerings from Nero publicly displayed. And he was writing around 100 years after Nero died. So if he did cheat at the Olympics and make a mockery of it, it seems no one minded very much. I'll link some more stuff in the companion doc as well. John Mordatis has a really interesting piece on it. That all being said, I still think the moving of the games for his own vanity project is still pretty tyrannical. Maybe just not as bad as everyone says. Now, on this trip, Nero also gave the Greeks something really special, their independence, which has survived to us in an inscription where the Greeks are declared free. Now, just to be clear, he's not actually freeing Greece. He's not like releasing it from the control of Rome. He's actually just transferring Greece from a senatorial province to an imperial province. But part of that is that he's lifting taxes on Greece. If you remember, like 10 minutes ago when we were talking about how desperately the empire needed money, this is a terrible call. This last year, these last couple of years after the Great Fire are really where I feel like the Nero was a tyrant camp have their absolute strongest claim. This is a terrible move. I don't know why Nero did it. Again, he very clearly loved Greece and he very clearly loved the arts and he really wanted to be accepted, I think. And I think this was a way for him to be accepted by these men that he admired so much, was to just, give them gifts. But it was just a bad call. It was just a terrible call. It was an inept call. So, yeah, I'm with the Nero as a tyrant camp on this one. This was a terrible move. I know I'm beating a dead horse at this point, but Nero's real problem was money. Suetonius relating that he couldn't pay the soldiers, and at one point he had to suspend the grain dole. And expensive bread is a great way to ferment populist rebellion. See France. And during this time, taxes remained high, which is also a great way to lose the support of the rich and powerful. Because in either late 67 or early 68, the end truly began, when Gaius Julius Vindex revolted in Gaul, pledging himself to the governor of Hispania at the time, and later emperor, Galba. Now, this rebellion initially went quite poorly. Nero had sent Rufus to deal with Vindex, but Rufus had apparently turned traitor and decided to team up with Vindex. However, in a weird twist of fate, when Vindex's army approached Rufus's army, the soldiers in Rufus's army weren't aware of that, so they attacked Vindex's army and won, whereupon Vindex threw himself on his sword. Rufus now took up the mantle of rebellion as well, and Petronius, someone Nero had sent out after Rufus, also turned to the side of Galba.
Support for Galba was, in large part, based on a promise of payouts, although not all of these promises had been made by him. And when he wasn't able to make those payouts is when a lot of people turned on him and he was eventually deposed. So it does seem like it was all about money at the end of the day.
So let's now look at Nero's death and what transpired after. Nero's death has been dramatized by pretty much everyone who's ever written about it. But from the accounts that we have, here's the short version of the story. Nero gets back to Rome in either very late 67 or very early 68. Now, we have very little evidence of what Nero was doing in Rome at this point, but from the historians, he was just throwing lavish parties. But again, I'm a little loath to trust them because the idea of like, the despot is throwing these wild parties while the people are starving in the streets is a very, very old trope. Sometime in the middle of 68, Nero saw the writing on the wall. Plutarch claims Nymphidius Sabinus, who had been appointed second in command of the Praetorian Guard, had at that point won most of them over to his side, and he had told them that they should stop supporting Nero because Galba, when he came to power, would give all of the Praetorian Guard a bunch of money. Tacitus's earlier claim seems to back that up. And Suetonius claims that one night Nero awoke to find himself alone with all his guards gone and realized what was happening, and so resolved to flee the city. The Senate declared Nero an enemy of the people, and some number of people set off to try and capture him because you could get a fair amount of money from turning over an enemy of the people to the Senate.
Nero, either in that villa or in a separate cave, chose instead to end things on his own terms, uttering not badass lines as he dies, which just, I don't know, that just feels like doing him dirty after you give everyone else all these badass lines and then his final line is, oh, what an artist the world loses in me. That just seems mean, man. Like, come on, he's already dead.
But the interesting part comes after his death. Now, the Nero did nothing wrong camp initially started from a couple claims from Suetonius and Tacitus. Suetonius claimed that even though the city celebrated Nero's death, many people continued to lay flowers on his grave for years to come, and indeed, false Neros would rise up from time to time. These were people claiming to be Nero who would receive varying levels of support. None of them ever came anywhere close to taking over the empire, but many of them did get small bands of people under them, which speaks in some part to Nero's popularity, as does Tacitus's claim that while the upper classes celebrated, the lower classes, which keep in mind would have been about 80% of Rome at this time, actually mourned the loss of Nero. In addition, we have from Dio Chrysostom, not different Dio, same first name over and over, that as far as the rest of his subjects were concerned, there was nothing to stop him from being emperor forever. Now, he goes on to say that Nero was deposed because Sporus told everyone what his plans were, and the whole thing is clearly mocking Nero. So this guy who hates Nero clearly felt that he needed to address those who might take issue with him portraying Nero in this way. I'm going to add a little spice to this as well. I think that Nero actually may have been unpopular when he died, but I think when Vespasian came to power, people realized there wasn't much Nero could have done, and they kind of turned back to wishing for someone who, at the very least, would still give them games and bread and circuses. Vespasian was born an equestrian, and only on his mother's side. His father was a moneylender by trade. This wasn't great in the eyes of the Senate, as the Principate, not even 100 years old at that time, had really only been held by 5 people, ignoring the year of the 4 emperors. And all of them had been of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. It was fine if someone not of that dynasty rose to power, but someone without even a senator in their family line? Well, that was kind of pushing it. And from the little we know, Vespasian was also hated by the Stoics, the same people who supposedly had also hated Nero. There's a famous story where one of them is going into the Senate house and Vespasian basically forbids him from doing so. And he basically just says, well, look, man, I'm a senator. I'm going to play my part. You go ahead and play yours, and goes inside. Again, I don't know how true it is because, again, just all these Romans right before they died just are the most badass lines. I don't know. Maybe we just need to look into that more.
In addition, Vespasian also imposed very high taxes on the empire, the very thing that got Nero deposed.
There's even this very famous story where, his son comes to him when he put the tax on urine back. And he's like, how could you put this tax back? It's immoral. And Vespasian holds up the money and he says, does it stink? And his boy's like, no. And he's like, and yet it comes from urine. And this is where the expression comes that money does not stink. Just, I hope that's the case. I don't actually know. This video is already overly long, so I don't want to focus too much on Vespasian, but I'll leave a couple links to the companion doc if you want to examine more into how he cemented his power. But the main point I'm trying to make is that Vespasian clearly had a lot stacked against him, and it seems like he put a lot of effort into making his rise to power seem as though it was divine providence, that Nero was a tyrant that the people of Rome needed saving from. Many modern historians believe that Vespasian engaged in a lot of propaganda, and one really good piece of evidence to support that is the fact that there aren't any positive histories of Nero. Now, I know you might say, well, maybe there just aren't any, but both Josephus and Tacitus tell us explicitly that there are overly positive histories of Nero. But for some reason, none of them have survived to us today. And even then, keep in mind that the majority of the histories that have come down to us were copied over by Christians, who were already, again, very poised to hate Nero. So Nero got raked through the coals twice. Once by the historians who wrote about him just after he died, and again by the later Christians who were copying his works. So, as we come to the end of this video, who was Nero? And how can we be sure? Well, the answer, unfortunately, is we can't. Tacitus tells us Nero was a promising young child who let his bad habits get the better of him. And as his guardians dropped off one by one, he grew worse and worse until eventually Rome couldn't handle it. Suetonius tells us that Nero had been bad from birth, but was able to be kept in check by his advisors for at least a little while. And Dio tells us Nero had been cruel from birth and was surrounded by cruel and insane people.
But I think I've shown these historians can't be taken as gospel. So let's take a look at everything we've looked at up until now and try and tell a different story of Nero.
But if there's one thing I hope you've taken away from this, it's that the story I'm about to tell, even though I think it's very well researched and I think I have a lot of sources to back it up, is just a story. You have to be the person to decide if that story sounds good enough for you to tell someone else. Nero was born into a bad situation, with a mother who merely wanted to use him to live out her own dreams. He grew up surrounded by assassins and power struggles while he himself was groomed to rule. And he was lucky enough to encounter two men, Seneca and Burrus, who truly seemed to have his best interests at heart and raised him as best they could. When he was only 17 years old, he was forced into a loveless marriage and then the throne. As he grew, he received education in poetry and music and found he had a real love of the arts. And he was even pretty good at it. His public appearances garnered a lot of attention, most of it positive, and he paid the Senate their due honors, striving in every way to be the benevolent dictator his tutor had taught him to be. His childhood had left him paranoid, but he was already dreaming big. He saw the hardships of the commoners and tried to help as best he could, ruling in the ways that he thought was right.
He had some great ideas, but wasn't very detail-oriented, and often overlooked some of the problems his solutions could bring about.
As he gained more independence from his mother, she began to openly threaten him and plot against him, saying she would even support his stepbrother for the throne. The following year, his stepbrother would die tragically of a seizure in front of him, his mother, and his new wife. He had hoped that would calm his mother, but it didn't, and she continued to plot. With his paranoia growing every day and the threats of his mother ringing in his ears, he finally killed his mother, possibly with the help of his advisors. And then for a bit, he was free. He was trapped in a loveless marriage, but he had a lover on the side, and he really did seem to love her. He embarked on grand building projects, tried to focus more on consolidation than unnecessary wars, and even tried to introduce his love of Greek culture into the Romans, which was met with wild success. His poetry was lauded far and wide, and even his singing, private for now, was still very well received. Then, at the age of 24, he found out his lover was pregnant. He was so excited for a daughter, he couldn't divorce his old wife quickly enough, and finally marry his lover and celebrate it publicly. But his adoring fans, the people, didn't like this, and they openly protested it. And his old paranoia resurfaced. He let it get the best of him and had his ex-wife executed, even though she really wasn't a threat to him at that time. Regardless, his first daughter was born, and Nero was so happy he showered both her and his mother with titles and love and everything he could possibly give. But 5 months later, his daughter would be dead. The next few years were a bit calmer. He did more buildings and, again, did more performances, this time some publicly even. And I'm sure the applause, in a way, must have tried to fill that hole in his heart.
But attention like that is just a temporary high. And so Nero got addicted.
And during this time, the peace-loving emperor was facing a serious problem, that Rome didn't have enough money, and things got worse when the city burned down. Nero rushed over to help everyone, even opening his own properties so that people could make use of it, and buying grain and wine for them. Nero had a grand dream of how to rebuild it, but he wasn't looking far enough. His plan was great. Everyone agrees the city he built was fantastic, but all of that was expensive. Both Nero and the country's coffers were quickly running empty, so he raised taxes. How else do you pay for things? But this was a bad call when the economy was already in such a bad shape, and it likely made him a lot more enemies than it did friends. Nero dreamed of beautiful wide streets, luxurious baths, but also a giant golden palace. It was to be open to the public, of course, but a giant golden monument to the emperor rising over a city of ash was not what the populace needed to see. And anyone from the provinces paying such high taxes who did come to Rome would look at this monument to the emperor and think, is that where my money's going? And so a plot formed. It wasn't huge, and it was given away pretty early on, but it really broke Nero, because one of the people named in it was Seneca. But Seneca himself had told Nero that a leader sometimes had to make hard choices. And so Nero did. He made a very hard choice. And so when a rebellion broke out, not some plot of poison, but soldiers marching on Rome, the Senate saw their chance and took it. A new Caesar would save them and give them not only the respect they deserved, but free them from these high taxes as well. Nero's execution had also gotten rid of quite a few men, meaning a lot of new faces were able to join the ranks. And not all of these faces had the same kind of loyalty. One of them even convinced many of Nero's guards that when the new emperor came to power, they would all receive a large sum of money. And so, one night, Nero woke to find himself alone. The result of certainly some bad circumstances, but a lot of the choices he'd made to get there as well. Nero realized that death, the death that had been following him since he was 10 years old, had finally come for its due. But like I said, that's just my story. But Nero, the beloved actor, never got to tell his story. And so we're left to pick up the pieces and try and tell his story for him. I'm going to put up, by the way, all the surviving works we have that we know were written by Nero. And it's not a lot, but I'm just going to talk for a bit now too. So thank you for watching. You can click off the video now if you'd like.
I want to thank everyone for the support on my last video. I genuinely was just doing it as a random project, and I was thrilled at how well it was received. I'm sorry this video took so much longer than I thought. There were a few issues with filming and audio, but I also just severely underestimated how long the editing would take. My next video is going to be about the Roman religion, and hopefully I can get it out a bit quicker, but I'm just going to ask you to bear with me while I get everything done. I'm also really trying to get these videos closer to an hour, if only because that would shorten my production time, but I just always end up with so much information by the time I'm done researching, and I actually end up cutting quite a lot of stuff to try and streamline it. Anyway, I won't keep you longer. Thanks for getting this far. I hope you learned something about Nero and enjoyed the video. I'll see you on the next one.